Hello, everyone. I'm Michael Macniak, and this week we're doing a special episode of the Holding It Together Kinda podcast. We're stepping into a space that many of us find difficult to look at and much harder to even understand. To use an obvious pun here, I'm talking about hoarding. And hoarding has really become an obsession with many people for a few years now. Several years. Obviously the success of the TV show Hoarders is a testament to that and may be partly feeding that. In full disclosure, I've never seen the TV show. I have, however, seen some amazing, horrific impacts of hoarding in my work as an attorney in particular, and with obviously my work with Guardian and Care Coalition. I've even seen a situation, what I would call collective hoarding, where I had an entire family that was living together and they seemingly morphed into this outrageous behavior of collecting things, everything from dachshunds, the little dogs, to toilets, used toilets, no joke. Now, when most of us see a home that's, overwhelmed and cluttered, the first words that come to our mouth, they must be lazy. They must be just messy people. But if we get beyond that surface level, if we scratch a little bit deeper, we got to look at the people that are there in that home. It's not necessarily a choice, folks. There's really a psychological disorder that's very complex, and it's rooted in some real profound challenges. You have the internal struggle, where an object isn't just an object. It can be a memory or a safety net or a piece of one's identity on some level. And then you have what, we might also call the invisible burden that's going on. And with that, I'm talking about the headlines that we see in the TV segments, the most significant impact beyond the piles and the crowded hallways. It's what's going on inside the home. The husband who feels like he's a stranger in his own home. The kids who feel like they can't walk in. The literal and figurative wall that is being built up, and it creates this silence, and it's just profound throughout the home. It really lives at a really complex intersection of mental health, property rights, personal rights, and of course, community safety. So we're going to go beyond just the stuff that people are collecting, and we want to get into like the meat and potatoes, the soul of it. So I'm joined by my usual panel. Today, Sarah's not with us, so it's just Stephanie and Angela joining me. And we're going to get into a little depth around hoarding and some of the intricacies and some of the very fascinating aspects of it overall. Hello and welcome to the Holding It Together podcast. I'm your host, Michael Macniak. Here we will get real in our conversations about mental illness and caregiving and the messy reality of keeping it all balanced. There's no sugarcoating, no clinical jargon, just real talk about the hospitalizations, medication battles, and the toll it takes on the home and everybody in it. This is for the parents, siblings, and partners who are doing the impossible every single day. Holding It Together is a home for the overthinkers, the multitaskers, and anyone who's out there that's feeling like they're just one spilled cup of coffee away from a complete meltdown. Find us on YouTube at HitKinda, that is at HITKINDA, and subscribe, like, follow, comment. I don't know, vent, throw rocks, tantrum, whatever you need to do today. Just make yourself feel better, but please follow us. As we step out into our front line, the first question is, what is hoarding? What is it? And in order to get there, I think it's important to start with what it is not. Hoarding is not a mental illness. Angela, is that correct?
I mean, I would say, as a definition by itself, it's not a mental illness, but I believe that everything that goes into a person with hoarding could be something else that could be labeled as a mental illness. I think that there are so many aspects to the individual who has the hoarding that could, represent other types of mental illness, whether it be depression, whether it be trauma, whether it would be some type of perfectionism, this space that you take up of who you are and how you were raised, and then what created this process.
Okay, well that's a great question. Is it something that is inherited or learned?
I believe that it's both. I believe that it is inherited. I do believe that there are people out there who have had some other distant relative that they may or may have not even recognized was a hoarder until later on in their life when it's to their attention that they now are hoarding. And when they can go back and have really good therapy, more times than not, they find somebody else that they said, oh, I didn't really realize that that was really hoarding. But my mother collected everything and had all these books of everything. And then it made
Mhm.
everything feel important. And then you didn't feel like you could discard anything. And so that trait then was kind of embedded into, this person's life. And then other components, depends on how you were raised with your family. How was your dad treating you? So I do think it's a very, very complex, fully loaded picture when you're working with somebody who has been, struggling with a hoarding, situation.
Stephanie, in your experience, when you have this hoarding going on, is it something that is continuous? Is it ever growing?
I think it's circumstantial for certain people. I've had clients that it is continuous and, doesn't change really. It's just the consistent behavior. I have other clients that, are able to go through periods of time where it's mediated and kind of at bay. And then there's periods that it escalates and the shopping and hoarding starts all over again. So I think it's different on multiple scales. It could definitely escalate over periods of time and just go from like the hoarder show, which I actually have seen. It starts small and they kind of fill up one room and then it goes to now another room, now the whole house, but I think it just depends on the person.
Yeah, and what's amazing about that progression is the family that's sitting there and okay, we're going to let her have this one room. And then the one room bleeds into the next room. And then next thing you know, you're living in a house or a home with that's surrounded by stuff that can't be thrown away because of the various attachments. Hoarding
Well,
is classified as a disorder.
can I add to that though, Michael? Because as much as it is you know, when the family members are allowing their loved ones to have the room, right? It's a really challenging process. And maybe we can get into it later, but so much goes into the protection of the individual who is hoarding that the people that live with them or are surrounded by them also then try to mitigate or think that they're doing the best that they can to help them. And then everybody starts avoiding the anxiety. So once the horde starts going in from one room to another, then that's when everybody's defense mechanisms come in, and people are either going to run, or hide from it and avoid it, or they're going to approach it and try to clean it out. But then there's that anxiety side. So then I think that's where that struggle comes into where the family and the person who's struggling with the hoarding don't want to approach it anymore because it's just so stressful on both sides. It's just so complex.
Well, it's very complex. And I'll be the first to say I have not experienced hoarding in my personal life. As I said, I've seen it in my professional life on small levels and large, really nasty levels and everything in between. Uh, and it is mind-boggling to me how the hoarder themselves, can get themselves into this situation. But it becomes even more perplexing to me how the loved ones and that impact that the hoarding does have on the family. And I don't have the answers for it. It's just you brought it up, so I have to address it in my own way because it's just mind-boggling. And for all the people who are listening out there that are perhaps going through it, they're probably completely shaking their head in agreement with you that, yeah, this is something that crept up on us. Next thing you know, we're all kind of now part of this paper monster, no pun intended, that has enveloped our home without without giving it much attention at first, it's and it happens. But let me get back to what I was saying, because this fascinated me when I was doing research for today's episode. So, as I said, hoarding is classified as a disorder. It is not associated with any one severe mental illness any more than others. There are mental health disorders that it is associated with, but it's not, one does not mean, if you have this disorder, does not mean you're going to be a hoarder. If you have this illness, it doesn't mean, or if you have hoarding, it doesn't mean you're going to have this illness. So let me just give you some statistics. 50 to 60% of hoarders do have a form of depression. 20 to 30% of hoarders also have ADHD, or have ADHD, maybe not also, but 20%, this is what blows my mind. 20% of hoarders have OCD. That really surprises me, because I would have thought that number would have been the number one. I would have thought that number would be more like 75, 80% of people who are hoarding would be associated with some kind of obsessive compulsive disorder. Hoarding is associated with anxiety disorders and neurocognition issues like Alzheimer's and dementia. I can see that. I can see that for sure. Personality traits, and Stephanie, I think you were kind of touching on this a little bit, but some of the personality traits of people who are hoarding are indecisive. They're very often perfectionists, and they're procrastinators, and they have executive functioning issues, such as with planning and attention. So all that kind of makes sense, right? But what I want to discuss in detail is the reasons that we have assigned, as I said in my opening, to the interesting aspects of hoarding. And the first one, obviously, is the object as extension of self. So I have a widget that I'm refusing to give away, and it's because it has emotional significance to me. Great. I think every single one of us could point to something in our home that we keep around because it reminds us of our dad who passed away, our grandfather who passed away. But Angela, doesn't it get a lot more significant than just that?
I mean, for my experiences, I mean, yeah, that's a big part for some people. But for some people, though, it's more of the I can use this later. I can, the way that they view objects and things is very different than how I would view an object.
Yeah, but I
Um,
think that comes into the second part of the equation, the second pillar that I want to talk about. I'm talking about here where, okay, I have a sentimental attachment to this painting that is in my house. It was my father's painting. He had it above his desk all through his career. And when he more or less retired, I took the painting and I've always put it above my desk, wherever my workspace is. Whatever, for whatever reason, it's a guy taking a nap on a boat in some Caribbean island. It's,
mhm.
it means not that much to the place, but it's that attachment. I'm talking about the guy who says, I have this receipt from when me and Stephanie went out to lunch 10 years ago, and it reminds me of that lunch day, and it reminds me of Stephanie, so I can't throw it out, because if I do, it will kill my memory of Stephanie and in that day altogether.
Mhm.
So that's more of the extension of self that I'm talking about here. Yeah, did you want to add something to that, Steph?
Well, I was just going to say about the sentimental stuff. I have one of my clients where it's not definitely where the hoarding started, but definitely was a contribution to a lot of it. Her father had passed away. She took almost every single item out of that man's house and moved it into her house. And then her significant other passed away, and she took every single item out of their home or apartment and moved it into their house. So, I can imagine taking a few things that remind you of that person, but to then integrate their entire home top to bottom into your home. Now you have three homes worth of stuff in one house.
Yeah, and I think it's very touchy. I had a good friend that I was trying to help work through separation of believe it or not, a kitchen table. It was his dad's kitchen table, and his stepmom was adamant that she was going to keep it, and he had to work through, I mean, like trauma over having to get rid of this table. So it becomes very hard to understand, but at the same time, it's also so delicate, isn't it? When you're talking about someone's grief connection to an object or a series of objects.
Mm.
But in your case, you're talking about a woman who had three different houses full of stuff, no matter what it was, just because it was related to that one person.
Yeah, and I could see, from my perspective as a more rational person, I could see, keeping a shirt or a picture or a few things, but, I didn't see the connection to the coffee table or the 40 shirts that person owned, and then that's where it became overwhelming for her too, because at that point, the house is to the ceilings, every single
Yeah.
room inaccessible.
Yeah. No, I've seen that too. I remember walking into one little old lady's house. She had an apartment down in New Haven, and she barely could get the door open. And once she got the door open, it was, Angela, I think you were at this woman's house. It was a path of stacked up newspapers. For decades of newspapers made the path, the hallway through her house. And there was really no place to sit down. It was just newspapers stacked from floor to ceiling. And that it's just, I think that goes to the cocoon concept, the safety and security. I think she felt, this is the second pillar, the clutter that we see, I think for some people is an emotional screen or an emotional cocoon to keep out whatever it is they want to keep out, or to feel that sense of protection that they want to keep in. And the third pillar that we need to talk about is what Angela was bringing up, this responsibility on some level. For instance, I can't throw this toaster away because it could be fixed someday. I can't just let it lay in a landfill. It's bad for the environment, and somebody else may be able to use it someday. Well, next thing you know, you got 6 toasters, all with the same set of logic attached to them. Angela, you got any good stories about this? Because I know you do.
I do. I want to go back to your cocoon though, because we also had that mutual client where he had all the magazines and the movies that were,
What kind of
and he had his
magazines and
chair
movies,
right in the
Angela?
middle of all of his stuff. And he
Yes.
wouldn't move any of it. Even if we tried to organize it and tried to like get it up off the floor and stuff, he just couldn't
You know,
rationalize moving it because he needed to be able to see all of his pillars of stuff, and to make sure that everything was still there, and he really did cocoon himself literally inside the middle of his living room, which was really
and you know what's
challenging
funny
for
about
safety.
this? You know what's funny about you bringing that guy up? I totally forgot about him. Folks, not to beat around the bush, but one entire room of this man's house was dedicated to pornography.
Mhm.
Another room was totally dedicated to historical documentaries and like action films, I think, or something like that.
It was World War history was
Yeah,
one. He loved
like
history.
old westerns, I remember.
Yeah.
So you had films. He had more films than the old video stores used to have. I can't believe I totally forgot about him.
So it was organized hoarding.
It
Well,
was somewhat
it
organized.
was at
Yeah.
least categorized. I don't
Yeah.
know how,
There was some
but
organization to it.
I think he did. In fact, you go into the pornography room, and I'm pretty sure it was alphabetized at least.
Mhm.
It was it was beyond mind blowing.
But that goes
Um,
to the safety part too, right? Because he, as much as we really wanted him to change and to clean out his clutter, he wasn't able to do that. It just wasn't his time. And so, we had to go into harm reduction and safety and just make sure he at least had pathways and, but he did have his bathroom. He was still able to use his bathroom. He still had a bed area and he still had his chair.
and
It
his
just,
kitchen, in his kitchen.
and his kitchen. So he had
Yeah.
access to use everything. But for us as treaters, it's really hard to because you want to see all of that be a nice living space for him. But at least he was safe in there, and he just wasn't able to approach his clutter the way that we would like to see him approach it, like have it more organized off the floor, those types of things. But he was technically being safe, which I know you'll get to later on.
Yeah, we're going to definitely talk about that because that's a tough one.
The way that we look at something is very different. And, I did see Dr. David Tolan, which I will put a little plug in for his book, Buried in
Yeah.
Treasures.
Buried
Um,
in treasures, right?
Buried in Treasures. It was really,
David
really
Tolman.
important in my life in 2012 when I first started my social work career. especially with, hoarding and, those types of behaviors. But one of the things that was a really big takeaway is that the way that they view things is so different than we do. So if I see a collection of pens, I'm going to put all my pens together in one bin. But someone with hoarding, though, they're going to separate all those pens into different colors, lengths. Do they have a cap? What does the cap look like? And so they get overwhelmed with that process. And so they just end up sorting all these things, but not actually doing anything with them. And that's where people get kind of stuck.
And that's why I associate it in my mind with OCD. So I'm again shocked to find out that that's not necessarily true, but it also brings us to our next topic. You just bled right into it. You made a beautiful transition, the files versus the piles. Because on the one hand, we can be, I will organize pens and things like that accordingly. I might even put all this like colors together, but you're right. If I have to have all the Bic pens in one place and all the Papermate pens in another, I don't know. That's something that I don't do, but I'm sure people out there listening are. With hoarding, the difficulty with the categorization that Stephanie and I were just sort of joking about is that the people who are involved with hoarding, they think that everything is special. And therefore, nothing necessarily can be categorized together, right? So you can't just say a pen is a pen. Let's put all the pens here. Am I saying that correctly, Stephanie?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. But then we also have the issue of the problem with this decision making and problem solving, which then makes the act, in some cases, of sorting completely impossible, like the woman with the newspapers.
Mm-hmm.
So
you just end up sorting it into other piles in your sorting area. So then one pile now became 6 piles. And then those 6 piles now are going to become 12 piles. And then it's so overwhelming, you can't address any of the piles anymore because it's now they're too dispersed. And then that's when the avoidance comes in.
well, from what my research showed, I do not have great experience with hoarding in on a case by case level, on a clinical level like you guys. So I did some research so I can even engage in this topic with you guys. But what I think happens from what I researched, Angela, is that they have these fears of memory loss or attachment loss to whatever the object may be. And then they as you say, they put them into their piles, and now their memory loss is such that, well, I can't remember why I had that pile, but I need that pile to stay there because there's a purpose behind it somewhere. And sometimes folks don't even remember why they had the pile, the meaning of the pile, the categorization that Stephanie and I were talking about, or why something in that pile was special that led to the creation of the rest of the pile. Does that resonate with what you're talking about?
Yeah, absolutely. It's hard to. So when you're got somebody that's sorting and then can't discard, right? For whatever the reasons might be, because sometimes it could be because I can use that, or it's something so good, why would I need to sell it? So I'm going to wait and sell it. And then nothing ever happens with that. And then once you approach somebody about a certain situation where you're noticing now that these piles are now intruding into your life, then these defense mechanisms come out and various forms, right? Some people get depressed, some people get angry, and kind of probably brings you to your next part.
I was just going to say, are you reading the show sheet? You have it right in front of you, I bet,
Yeah,
right?
I got my show sheet out.
Yeah.
I'm prepared.
Because I was going to ask Stephanie about that. The emotional regulation and the parting, the pain of parting. When this is the third pillar that we often see. So we have our 3 pillars. We have the first one, which was, let me go back, the attachment, the extension of self. The second pillar is the information, the files versus the piles, and how we categorize or don't categorize. And then the third one is this emotional regulation. And as soon as you started saying that, I thought of Stephanie's example of the woman whose husband's passed away, or significant other.
Dad and significant other, yeah.
Dad and significant other. When you asked her or had discussion with her about getting rid of some of this stuff, what did that do to her, or from your perspective, what did it do? I mean, I did the research. I know what some of the things that physically goes on with somebody, but what did it look like on your end from your
So
perspective as a clinician?
I didn't actually for her in her case. So by the time I came in, that stuff was already in the house. It was already, I had learned to find out that a lot of the stuff in the house were belonging to these two people. But then in addition to that, she was also hoarding a lot of household items, home repair items. So there were other areas that were more in the focal point because the house was so heavily hoarded. So a lot of it I couldn't even see past a doorway to a bedroom of what was really in there. But a lot of the stuff in more, the living room and the kitchen where I would walk by was stuff she had acquired on her own. And when I tried to breach those type of topics of, all of this stuff that needs to be kind of managed a little bit better and probably disposed of if she wasn't using, it always came back to, oh, I can return that, or I need to use this PVC pipe for X project. And she's talking about returning things that are years old
Yeah, yeah,
purchased
yeah.
like that. Home Depot's not taking that back. So they're really it was a very, very difficult thing. And unfortunately in her circumstance, when she was psychiatrically stable, she had the pathways. She had access to her fridge, which was clean and well organized. She had access to her sink and her bathroom, and her bed was clear. So the necessities were being
Right.
met. So it wasn't as high up on my radar to kind of delve into the hoarding issue. But it was very apparent every time you walked into her house. If I kind of took one wrong step, this pile might collapse a little bit. Or she had a dog, and the dog would get very excited when people would come over. So the tail would start wagging, whack something off of there. And
Knock
then if
something off the table? Really?
well,
Yeah.
off of a pile, the tail would hit
Yeah.
the pile, and then all of a sudden stuff would start to fall into the pathways, and we'd have to pick it up and kind of put it back.
Did she
Um,
react like in an anxiety-ridden way that, oh my gosh, I have to get
no,
that fixed immediately?
no, like
See, I
she would
think
just
that's
walk
where my
past it,
OC,
pick it
that's
up,
where
and
my belief in the OCD comes in, that, oh my God, that fell over. I got to fix this right away and organize it. But that's not the case, is it?
no, she would kind of sometimes walk right past it. If it was something that happened in front of her, she would pick it up and put it back. But, if it happened when the dog was near me and she's on the other side of the island, she wouldn't come around immediately to pick it
Yeah,
up.
yeah.
She would just kind of fix as she went. But she was difficult too, because you'd ask her, like, here's this goal. I want you to clean off your kitchen island. Maybe we'd come back the next time. The kitchen island is clean, but I know all you did was move that stuff from point A to point B. It wasn't
Gotcha.
thrown away.
Yeah,
Um,
moving pile A16 to from the left
yes.
to the right, it
So
does
I
not
cleared
clean
this
it.
area, but now
Yeah.
I've made this area worse. It was
Right,
so
right,
it was
right.
hard. It was challenging.
But for these folks, it doesn't go to the physical area as much as it's all about the category or the sentiment attached to those particular items. When we talk about this emotional regulation, I could tell a story getting back to the family. I had I was representing an older woman who had two of her daughters living in the home with her. The two daughters had gone off on their own and came back because of divorces or whatever the case may be. And she had an adult son who was developmentally disabled, and he was living with her as well. Well, the oldest daughter and the son were had hoarding issues for sure. The mother did too, but hers was very different. The son would walk around town with a shopping cart, and he collected whatever things he could find that seemed interesting to him. He loved hubcaps from cars, and he loved toilets, discarded toilets, and he had piles of these things down in their basement. And it was his thing. Again, he was developmentally disabled. That was his thing, and he didn't have that emotional connection to it. Maybe it's because it was part of his developmental disability. But the older sister was collecting weird stuff, including dogs. She was every little, always little dogs. That's why I said I remembered there being like three or four dachshunds among other dogs, and she just kept saying she had to keep them. She had to take care of them because they were on the street. And I'm thinking, well, she's walking by somebody's house and she's taking the dog off of the lawn. Meanwhile, I'm representing the little old lady who's the mother of this group, and the dogs are peeing and pooping all over the house. There was nobody was cleaning anything. The house was, abhorrent. So it went to court. We had to go to court, and I had to report to the judge about this. And whenever he said that they had a certain amount of time to get it cleaned up, the horror, the visceral reaction that this family had collectively to having to get rid of this stuff was it was mind blowing. But that's one of the things. When people are asked to discard items like this, they very often feel, this is what I wrote down, a spike in anxiety that can feel like actual physical pain. And that's what I experienced with this family. I mean, the wailing, the crying and the begging. They have this avoidance of this painful anxiety is part of the reason that they keep collecting this stuff. And Angela, I don't do, I think I know the answer to this, but some hoarders avoid the process of categorizing and organizing their hoards altogether, don't they?
Yeah, I mean, there are some people with hoarding disorder that do not categorize and it's just placed down, and then that's when you see the extreme hoarders, right? Where there's so many like layers of possible garbage, newspapers, boxes, empty containers. They don't have that organizational class. And they might just be people who are acquiring and not categorizing. So the process of acquiring gives you that dopamine hit where you're actually feeling pretty good. And
Yeah,
so that might be
that's a
part
great
of the
way to say it.
process.
So you're getting the dopamine hit when you're getting the stuff, and to
Hmm.
get rid of the stuff is the exact opposite. And I don't know the medical term for what the opposite of dopamine hit would be, but it's a real downer.
Hmm.
So it's a self-fulfilling prophecy. Is that the right term? Basically, by avoiding throwing it away, you keep getting more of the hit, more of the hit, more of the hit by collecting more. So now you really got a hoarding situation going on,
Yeah, that
right?
process of avoidance is real. So, you want to feel better, and so you acquire. But then when you don't feel good again and you see everything that's going on, and most people do have some insight into that there's a lot of stuff, but then that anxiety creeps up again. And so to make me feel better, I'm going to go shopping, or I'm going to go and get this. And so it's a cyclical pattern of avoidance, really, right? I need to
Yeah.
feel good and I want to avoid being anxious. If I acquire, I feel good. Now I'm feeling anxious again because now I'm looking at everything. So I'm just going to go get something else new.
Stephanie, did you experience that when you're dealing with your clients who have exhibited the hoarding behaviors, that they fully acknowledge all the stuff, don't make excuses for it?
Yeah. I mean, out of the two of them, I think they both acknowledged at certain points that they do have a lot of stuff, but it's hard for them to also realize like this stuff needs to go. My client that had the worst hoard out of the two of them, every 3 bedroom, it was a 3 bedroom house. Every single room was filled in that house. The living room was inaccessible. It was pretty severe there. She actually was forced, was going to be having to move, and she was not able to participate in the moving process, but she wrote a list of what she wanted the movers to move specifically, which was asked of her to do. This list was 17 pages long, and it probably included everything in that house besides like the floorboards. Like she almost wanted every single piece to be moved into storage, which is just not
That defeats the
feasible.
purpose of the
Also,
whole
yes,
exercise. Yeah.
yes, but also, that it's not possible. We would have to get so many storage units to show all that. So there's a little bit of insight, but not enough to fix the problem. My other client, she's doing a lot better with her hoard. She's able to recognize it and say, I really need to start disposing of things, donating things. And she will also say, I try not to go to the mall because I know I'm just going to go shopping. Like she has very good insight into her hoarding. There is a walking group that she likes to attend with one of our community programs. In the winter, they walk at the mall, and she won't
Sure.
participate in the walking
Yeah.
group because she can't be around that.
She can't help herself.
She
Yeah.
doesn't have emotional attachments to things. It's not things she's grown up with that she has difficult getting. She's a shopper. So for
Right.
her, she just wants to go out and get a little good retail therapy, but then she has too much. So she's a lot more workable than my other client with more of those emotional attachments to her things on top of,
Yeah.
everything else she's purchased after.
I could see that as more of a, this is probably a horrible analogy, but the guy who knows that he can't be around alcohol because if he's around alcohol, he'll drink it and it's not good. So I give her kudos for that, that kind of insight.
Yeah, it's
Uh,
just easier for her to avoid this situation because she knows. She knows
right.
better.
But that's not in any way to insinuate that hoarding is necessarily on the same level as an addiction. Is that correct?
I don't think so. I mean, I think it has periods to it, like you get that shopper's
The
high or like
dopamine.
the
Yeah,
dopamine
yeah,
hit, like Angela
yeah.
was talking about when you get something nice and new. But I think for her too, after she's done shopping and she comes home and she sees, I have nowhere to put this. I
Mhm.
think that kind of comes back on her in a more negative way. She actually does have, when we were just saying how it ties into other mental illnesses, she has major depressive disorder. My
Oh,
other
there you have it.
client is bipolar, has bipolar disorder. So I thought that was interesting too, that it wasn't bipolar disorder was not listed as one of the other mental illnesses that can be associated with hoarding percentage wise.
I don't think that this was a mutually exclusive list that I
Yeah,
gave
I'm
you.
sure.
50 to 60% of hoarders do have a depression and have MDD,
Yeah.
right? 20 to 30 ADHD and 20% OCD. So I don't think it's mutually exclusive. I'm just saying that interestingly enough, here's something that we do see
Yeah.
as a parent. So what's clear to this point is that these three pillars that we've identified, this attachment, the extension of self, the files and piles, and then the pain of parting pillars are not mutually exclusive either, right? They don't exist in isolation. One can feed into the other. I mean, we've talked about the fear of throwing something away because it could be useful in two of those three categories at least. So that's something to bring in where the if you have a pile of paper, right? You your information processing may lead you to believe that you need that paper, so it leads to a pile. Now you got a pile of papers that leads to the attachment because that somewhere in there is that sentimental bit of it, and then the emotional dysregulation makes the idea of throwing it away completely painful. And I think that's interesting because we very often try to categorize things so much that we forget that a lot of stuff is very much interrelated, and this is no different. So I want to talk about something that Angela alluded to before, because as a lawyer, I have been involved in situations where I'm going in as a representative of an individual, like the two women that I referred to already. I forgot about the gentleman with all the videos and books, but that wasn't a protective thing. This was to go in there and find out what's going on in the home, almost like a safety check, right? And this becomes tough because you're going into places where there's congregate living very often. And when you have piles and piles of stuff, very often at least it piles and piles of garbage and waste attracts bugs and other critters environments that we don't want in our congregate living settings. We've all heard about the bed bug blights and we've heard about the cockroaches and I mean I walked into a woman's house one time and I had a nice suit on and shoes having just walked out of court and I walked into this woman's house and it was appalling. And the first thing I noticed when I looked down is that my feet basically had cockroaches all over them. My nice shoes. It was just now those are going to go into the next neighbor's house. So, we really have to worry about that fire hazard. The woman with the newspaper stacked from floor to ceiling, major fire hazard. No landlord's going to let that stay because of the danger to the person, but also to the rest of the people. We also have blight laws that require us to keep our homes presentable within a community. So our neighbors don't have to look at what appears to the rest of us as garbage piled up on our streets. Now, this stuff takes, in fact, Sarah's neighborhood, Sarah's not here, but she could talk about this. When you drive into her very nice neighborhood of 2,000 and 3,000 square foot homes, there's this one home that's just as lovely, but it is just absolutely covered with unkempt trees. The grass has never been cut. One home out of these 35 homes that are just beautiful, this one home is what you remember. And Angela, you're nodding your head. You know the home I'm talking about exactly. So these blight laws and these orders to get things cleaned up take a long time to go into process, which gives the person who is the hoarder much more time to continue their craft, if you will. What I'm getting at is most of us just don't get it. We just don't understand how you can live like that, right? Why don't you just see this mess and get it cleaned up? Okay, welcome to our system overload segment where we talk about the clinical need exceeding the infrastructure's capacity. We're looking at the blown fuses, the revolving door discharges, the 400-mile record gaps and data blackouts. This is where we stop asking how the patient is doing and ask more about why the big machine is glitching, why the machine is breaking down for that particular patient. So when in terms of getting to our sort of system overload segment that we do with this panel, on this podcast, on the Holding Together kind of podcast, we try to take a look at the human impact of mental health. So what I want to do is I want to think more about the hammer of the legal remedy, which is when the city shows up with the dump truck, literally, and has stuff taken out of the home and thrown into the trucks and taken to the dump. But how does it affect the family? How does it affect the individual and the caregivers? Beyond the obvious, what do you see is going in the trenches in that home? And Angela, are there particular treatments that are used to address hoarding in the person who is doing the hoarder themselves? Is there particular treatments that tend to be more effective and impactful than others?
I mean, the biggest, treatment, is, cognitive behavioral therapy. So if they can get a therapist that will outreach to them, to the home, to be able to start addressing the underlying issues of why they may be hoarding or not. Again, you're going to come into all types of other things, like you already mentioned, like, they could have some depression, they could have some trauma. So cognitive behavioral therapy is the first.
Explain to everybody, and Stephanie, please chime in, what CBT, cognitive behavioral therapy, strives to do, if you could, just to dumb it down for people like me who don't practice this every day.
Yeah, so it's really just kind of looking at the way you're thinking about things. So if you're looking at, and we call it negative thoughts, the thinking kind of things, they kind of creep into your mind about, all or nothing. Like I need to keep all of this because if I don't, then this is all going to happen. Or black and white thinking, like there's no gray. It's this way or no way. And that kind of feeds into like perfectionism, and all of us have these negative thoughts. But for people with hoarding or other disorders, the pendulum is the tips too far on one side, and so then they start believing these thoughts. And the cognitive behavioral therapy is hopefully going to help them see that there's another way to think of something. And how do you get there to get to that other side of thinking? It's not all or nothing. There can be some gray. It doesn't have to be perfect. It can be good enough. And how do you get there? So that's what CBT really does. And for people with hoarding, exposure therapy is the other part of it. Is let's look at this thing that you're attached to. How can you let it go? Like what are your feelings? What are your thoughts? How are you processing this item, and hopefully helping them address it. So if it's, I'm afraid that I'm going to mess up or I'm going to throw away something that's really valuable, the exposure therapy might be, well, let's throw away something valuable and see what happens. Let's do it together. That type of processing.
Well, and so then, Stephanie, when you're working in a clinical capacity with folks that are hoarding, what is the value, or what, I mean, how high is the value of earning their trust to be able to say to them, let me hold your hand and help you to throw this item in the garbage? I mean, that says, trust me, if you throw this away, the world is not going to end. Let's hold my hand, hug me, do whatever you got to do. What is the value of building that relationship?
I think that's huge. I think that's all of it. Like, if they don't trust you, they're not going to be willing to work with you through all of this. It's very difficult for them to let go of even one singular item. It's also very time consuming. I mean, if you were to go through an entire hoarder's house with them item by item, it would probably take
17
years.
pages worth.
Years, because then every item has a backstory, or a back and forth conversation of why they can't get rid of it. It's not a simple yes or no. So I think definitely building trust with that person, so the process can move a little bit quicker, and also them knowing that you understand their thinking and how they feel about these items, and you're not just viewing it as junk and let's move this along kind of thing. I also think for people, when the dumpsters show up and other people start just throwing everything away because it needs to go, is very traumatic for them.
Has to be. Yeah.
They need to be involved in the process and be making the decisions and be okay, or they're just going to start hoarding all over again. It's fixing the issue at hand, but it's not fixing the larger problem on a bigger scale, where they'll just start hoarding all over again.
You should have seen me and my friend trying to move my ex-wife from Ohio to Connecticut when we were getting married. That was, and she wasn't categorized as a hoarder, but some of the stuff that was sentimental to her, and we had to sneak stuff out of the house. But anyway, all right. So along those same lines, then you build the trust with someone, and you theoretically can get them to recognize that there may be some stuff that can go theoretically. Does that trust building, and is it a logical next step along those ways to impress upon the hoarder the emotional impact that it's having on the other people in the home? And is that possible, Stephanie?
Yeah, I think so. I think it's emotional for everybody that's in the home too, especially if you're not the hoarder yourself. I know a lot of people end up at, like, if their mother's hoarding, you get that behavior too, and then you kind of start becoming a bit of a hoarder. But also for the people that, don't want this and just have learned to live with it and are ready at any cost just to dump it all because it doesn't matter to them. I mean, it's probably very emotional toll on them as well. And that, you just don't know how to approach it with your loved one. Like Angela was saying, I think in the beginning, that it could be very an anxiety ridden kind of conversation, even breach. So sometimes it's easier just to not talk about it. So I'm sure it's difficult for them as well.
Oh, I can't. It's got to be. I mean, it just gives me anxiety just having this discussion. Angela, you wanted to add something here?
Yeah, I was just thinking back to the one time that we had to do a clean out. The landlord had already gotten involved, and the daughter, had to move out her stuff. The daughter was, in her 50s, and she had two adult grown children, and they had been for years trying to help her manage this hoard so she wouldn't get evicted. And unfortunately, the eviction still happened. And sometimes when you have a hoarding situation like that, the family needs the team to come in. They need the social worker there to help their loved one because they just don't have the emotional space for it. They just want them to be better, but they also need to clean out this hoard that they probably have done 3 times already and don't want to repeat the same process. Now they have a homeless mother. There's all these emotions that come into it. But I do think that one of the things that was good for this situation was that there was a team. There was the landlord who was kind of the enforcer that this had to happen, the social worker and the clinical team supporting the family and, the individual who was being evicted. And, the property manager was also involved. And, so everybody kind of took a role to be able to effectuate the change. But then the clinical team would have to then carry out the actual hard work, right? Which is the cognitive behavioral therapy, the readiness for change, so that it doesn't repeat the pattern. But I think when you're first initiating the hoarding situation, and it usually comes from some type of law enforcement or housing, where the family is already exhausted to that point. They've already tried 3 or 4 times to help their loved
Well,
one. So
okay. So this brings us naturally into the final segment that we get into, which was the cracks in the system. As you've seen, we often talk about this concept of a safety net, but now I want to look at the cracks. This is our segment that we call the cracks. These are the invisible lines where families lose their voice and patients lose their way, from rigid privacy barriers that prevent or isolate loved ones to financial abysses, which are always halting progress. We're asking, why are these gaps here and who is falling through them? In this segment, we stop looking at the person who fell and start inspecting the holes in the floor that they were forced to walk upon. And one of those cracks you just talked about is the team of people that it takes to effectuate the change in the event that we move to an actual clean out of the hoarding. If it gets to that point, our work at Guardian has always been to coordinate those teams very specifically, assign roles and duties very specifically amongst the team. We don't assign it. The team assigns themselves to certain roles. And it's extremely important in these kinds of interventions, because that's what you're talking about. It's an intervention, that everybody knows their roles, sticks with it, and follows through with that piece of the role. The interesting thing that I found in my research is that these cleanouts most often result in a recurrence of a hoarding episode. It does not usually work on the first time, much like an intervention with somebody who is an alcoholic or a drug addict, right? It doesn't necessarily take on the first time. So there's one of the problems. One of the cracks in the system is getting that team really hyper organized and understanding that we may be back here again, doing the same thing again. I mean, this is not a one and done kind of deal. But one of the things that I see as a crack in our system is identifying who and where and what is available for the hoarder and for the family trying to care for the hoarder. So since hoarding is not a mental illness, does it fall under the auspices of the Department of Mental Health? Does it fall under the Department of Developmental Disabilities or Social Services? Or what agency do you see getting involved with it most often?
I mean, for me, it's mostly the mental health side, because I do think that a lot of people with hoarding have co-occurring disorders, like you said, with the major depression or OCD or whatever else they might be experiencing with anxiety. I would say the Department of Mental Health is probably one of the bigger ones, along with social services, because the other side of people with hoarding that's gotten to a certain point is more older adults. The
That's what I
two,
was going to say.
yeah.
Your aging populations lead to dementia. Obviously, that's one of the unfortunate things about getting old. Dementia kicks in. Dementia is a trigger for hoarding. We've seen that, and the agency that I've seen involved most often in my work, from the legal perspective, is the Department of Social Services / Elderly Protective Services,
Mhm.
because very typically it's the landlord and other residents who are seeing this on the first-hand basis.
Mhm.
Very typically folks are not caught up in service systems. They're not caught up in mental health, the Department of Mental Health. Yes, we see it in our work because, as you said, mental illness very often has a component of hoarding to it, or vice versa. But, in real life, a good call to a local Department of Social Services agency, elderly protective services for outreach, even the police for a wellness check, I think, are good resources that are available to people in the community. Stephanie, do you had anything to what you agree with those? I mean, what other resources do you see that people are using to address the hoarding in their lives?
No, I definitely agree with that. The Department of Mental Health, and especially too Department of Social Services and the EPS when it gets to that point. I think, a lot of times when hoarding is the biggest issue is when landlords or other people are noticing it and it becomes a safety problem. I've had clients that had a Section 8 voucher. So, the voucher, you have to have your home inspected on a yearly basis, or the fire marshal comes out to deem your home safe and appropriate. And then you're kind of under like, a time limit with, okay, I'm coming back in 3 weeks. These are the problems that need to be fixed before I could pass your home. And, that's important too, because if it doesn't pass, Section 8 isn't going to pay their portion of the rent. And then, you're jeopardizing the housing for that person.
Well, and that creates more stress and more anxiety and leads to more hoarding and wanting that dopamine. It's such a vicious cycle.
Yeah.
And, the last word on this from me would be that we also have to be cognizant and worried about the dignity of the human right to collect their stuff versus the safety of other people, the safety of that person, and how we make a balance for all of those things. We can get in as a fiduciary. What are my roles as a court appointed fiduciary to keep this person safe while trying to honor their wishes and respect their wishes as well. So there's no easy answers for this, but folks, I think that, if you're listening, you good places to start are your local. Some towns have social workers. Some, if not, you can call your city or your state and ask them to get involved and make
Task
referral.
force now too. In Connecticut, we have a hoarding task force.
It's a hoarding task force.
Mm-hmm.
Who runs that? Wouldn't that be the Department of Social Services?
I'm not really sure who runs it, to be honest. I'm not sure if it was a city and by town type coalition type effort
so people
help.
can go to like their 211 helpline in their local community and ask for hoarding. I mean, that's great advice. We have the suicide hotlines. There's people out there that can refer you to the right places.
We also have professional organizers that have been involved with hoarding and cleanouts that are more sensitive to this population too. So, if that was another resource where you could think that they could get organized or, could do it with a professional organizer, then that's also another resource that is available.
Right. All right. Well, this has been a pretty interesting discussion from my perspective. As I said, you guys were fired up to have this talk, and I'm glad we did because it was interesting to me to do the research, and I learned a lot about it, and it opens up my eyes to, I've dealt with it from the legal perspective. You guys deal with it from the clinical perspective, and we've both seen it boots on the ground in the homes, and the people who are listening are living with it. And again, we gave you some solutions possibly. We're just pointing out to you that the mess, no pun intended, the messiness of this is not something that you're alone in, and that there are other people that are on the same journey as you. So Angela and Stephanie, thank you again. We'll see you guys all in a couple of weeks. Until then, try to hold it together, kinda. All right, as we close out this episode of Holding It Together, kinda, I'm something is resonating in my brain. You can't just fix, quote unquote, a hoarding situation by just throwing the items away. If you clear a house but leave the attachment or the processing struggle or emotional regulation issues that we talked about, you haven't solved the problem at all. You've just created trauma. And that trauma is real, it's pervasive, and as I said earlier, it's visceral. So for the families that are listening, your frustration is valid. It's exhausting, absolutely exhausting to feel like you're playing second fiddle to a stack of papers or a collection of broken clocks or old toasters. But remember, for your loved ones, those items are not trash. They're a shield. They may be a connection to you on some level. And you can't just ask someone to put down a shield like that until they feel safe. So for the professionals, we gotta stop working in our trained silos. And when we're working in a group on complex disorders like hoarding, the hammer of the housing court may clear a hallway, but it's not going to stop the cycle that we're talking about. So this is where we combine together as a care coalition, where we approach as attorney, as clinician, as family. We're all reading the same playbook. We're all addressing and sticking together through what admittedly is a very difficult situation and can be for a prolonged period of time. So this is more about clearing paths than just getting rid of junk. It's about clearing paths for people to live safely, and especially in a manner that's meaningful to them. I'm Michael Macniak. I hope this episode helps you to understand why your loved one may be, in a mode where they just insist that they aren't hoarding. And learn from the research I did and from what we heard today, that folks feel that they're just barely holding it together, kinda. And we'll see you next time.